Good evening, everyone. Today, we welcome you to another installment of Table Talk, a series of conversations with academics, writers, and activists who write on human-animal relations in Asia, in South Asia. We're the Indian Animal Studies Collective. I am Susan Harris, and my co-host Anu Pandey is also here. We aim to bring together academics and scholars who are working on animals in India. Today we have with us Paul Keil from Czech Academy of Sciences. We'll be talking to Paul on his new book, The Presence of Elephants, Sharing Lives and Landscapes in Assam. Thanks, Paul, for accepting our invitation. The conversation, again, is just for 1 hour, so please don't wait till the end to ask Paul or comment on something we're talking about because the 1 hour goes by really quickly. I thought we could start the conversation by discussing one of the main, I think, theoretical interventions or stances you're taking in the book, which is to talk about presence and situate yourself as situate presence as a response to talk about human-elephant conflict and also to account for the everyday living with elephants. So could you tell us a bit more about this idea?
Problems. And yeah, thank you very much, Susan and Anu, for inviting me to your fantastic series of talks. So yeah, it's a good question. I think, this idea of presence and co-presence is something that just kind of like organically emerged from being an ethnographer, right? And, we're generally just interested in experience and, day-to-day living. And as well as a kind of multi-species researcher, I'm also interested in exploring these kind of reciprocal and inter-experiential relationships between people and, non-human animals. So I kind of give it some emphasis in the book, not only because it's just a general, kind of organic way by which I write and think about human-animal relationships, but also because it's a way to kind of go beyond this standard term of coexistence, right? It's a nice word, coexistence. It's actually doing a lot of valuable work. It's bringing a lot of different disciplines together, but at the same time, it doesn't really tell me much about human-animal or human-elephant relationships in the way. And I was kind of looking for a word that might do better work there, and so I think co-presence was useful for that. So yeah, I think in co-presence is not my own term. Of course, it's been in anthropology and other disciplines, but I mean, in the ways that it allows me to speak about how people are being affected by elephants, and in turn, people are affecting elephants too, at multiple scales and in multiple ways that are beyond just like, interaction, for example. So, it can be interaction and it can be that kind of kinesthetic resonance, but also there's other ways of thinking about different senses and stuff like that, atmospheric impressions, and, even kind of things that are hard to explain as well, like intuitions and sixth sense. So I think this co-presence is the kind of like basic way in which I understand human-elephant relationships, and I think that's basically, it cuts across the entire book. I would say, yeah.
One of the things I was curious about because I'm thinking about this in my own work, which is that, sometimes people will say that when you want to talk about real animals, it's not like there's a real animal out there, as in the animal is simultaneously real but also symbolic and so on. But I feel like multi-species ethnography, and this is something you emphasize as well, allows you to deal with the real elephant, the elephant that the people live with, elephants that people live with. But at the same time, I'm also aware that when conservationists go onto the field and talk to people, they'll ask people, especially if they're doing surveys, they'll ask people which word do you associate with an elephant, and often that's in the realm of the metaphor or the symbolic. So I don't know, I just wanted to know, have you you know do you have an opinion on this subject? Does the metaphor creep in? Is there a real animal? Is there a real elephant?
Yeah, so that's a good question. It's a really good question, and maybe it's a good question because I try and I don't like to tangle with metaphors. Like I mean, I think for me it's a kind of crude. It's not a very honest way of taking what people are saying seriously about these beings they're interacting with all the time, right? Like and also this notion of symbol. So I think rightly or wrongly, sometimes I take at face value what people say elephants are and what they can do and what they might be doing. And it's not just symbolic or something else. Let's say we're talking about certain things like more than animal or godlike capacities. And maybe for some people, when they talk about elephant as being godlike or maybe a manifest like relating it to Ganesh, it is an association, right? And it might be a symbolic association. But I generally also found that people, at least where I was working, like they believe like it's a manifestation in the flesh, right? I mean, this is something that's in the world. And so when people start talking to me and telling me that elephants can understand their heart and they can understand what they're thinking and feeling, yeah, these I think I take these as really real kind of things in the world, and which upon which a lot is at stake, right? Especially if you're living with these gigantic godlike beings who might take what you say to offense sometimes too.
Right. And in relation to that, how do you what do you think about the elephant subjectivity? Because that's again something that you say you believe in, and that you think they are subjective beings. But I sometimes notice that there is a tension between the subjectivity of the elephant and uh, the question of livelihood for people. So especially when they respond to elephants negatively, when they are forced to take action, I felt like the livelihood takes precedence. And so, do you think that is because, and this is, I found this really interesting. I don't remember exactly the word you used, but I don't think you used the word inaccessibility, but something about how you can't really access the elephant and understand or comprehend what they're about. So could the precedence of livelihood and people, I'm sure you encountered people talking to you and telling you that they destroyed all this. So my question is, could their talking to you and the elephant not talking to you, could that have led to the inaccessibility of the elephant?
Also a very good question. So I think there's maybe a couple of parts of this question, so I'll try and like take it step by step. So I think maybe I think methodological. So I think farmers like obviously I think all farmers believe they are in tune with the elephants being subject, right, as ever having their own experiences, individual lives, and variation to certain degrees, right? And I think and there's a lot of ways that people who live next to elephants on the forest edge engage with them, right? It's not only in situations of defending against crops. It could be when an elephant comes out and everyone just takes the time off to observe how they're interacting with each other and having a great time. And there you see this real richness of like, how people talk about these lives, interior lives of these elephants, right? When it gets to situations, for example, when they're pushing elephants away from crops and back into the hills, I mean, subjectivity is a huge part as well, right? I mean, this is if you're approaching a big animal like that, you really have to be paying attention to what they're thinking, what they might be feeling, and how they're going to, respond to you in that moment. So subjectivity is always there. It's just that, I think, and rightly so, I mean, when something so much is at stake like your crops, which is your potential livelihood for the entire year, like you just have to kind of like you have to give yourself precedence. Well, the farmer does in this instance. Farmer gives themselves precedence and pushes the elephant back. And it's people understand that it's difficult for the elephant, that the elephant kind of gets into a situation sometimes where they can't control themselves. They want to eat the crops, but at the same time, and then, and they feel bad for the elephants too. But I mean, I think this is just a kind of, for me, this is just a normal, pragmatic aspect of everyday living, right? So I think there's that. So I think farmers now there's another part of the question about like this inaccessibility of subjectivity. So now I was kind of thinking about this after the book, and if you look at the book, I do different kind of chapters that look at interact or encounters with elephants in very different contexts, right? And I think that the level of detail by which I engage the subjectivity of the elephant will vary from chapter to chapter. So I'd say like the most intense and like intimate times where elephant subjectivity is engaged is like with the working elephant, like that you have most access to a working elephant in this situation. You can, see them all the time. You can start to comprehend what they might be thinking and feeling. And then there are other places like in the forest where I hardly can, I don't want to be next to an elephant, firstly. And like it's also just hard to interact with them that, their subjectivity, who they are as individual, as subjects, as individuals, but also their experiencing is so distant from me, I can't really comprehend it. Right. So there's you see all these variations throughout. And so I think if a farmer doesn't have a sense of a sense of elephant subjectivity, and particularly the elephant as a kind of subject, like as an individual subject, where their subjectivity has been shaped by history, individual subjectivity has been shaped by history, life history, environment, politics of the area. I think it's because that, people are always at a distance to elephants to some degree, right? They're not like you can live right next to elephants, but it's advisable that you don't live too closely to them and in ways that like could be damaging, harmful, and problematic. So people, they do want to keep away from them, right? And I think that kind of cautiousness, trying to balance proximity and distance is, an important part, the mode of survival and coexistence, but it also means that, elephant livelihoods, elephant worlds, elephant experiences can't be known as well. And I think, I think I think for me, that's what I learned from people, like no doubt. I think, my understanding of elephants was shaped ethnographically that way, but also like, I guess the third part that I want to add is like methodologically speaking, as an ethnographer, like, who primarily, walks around talking to people at a local scale. Like, I also have trouble understanding who elephants are because they live at scales so much larger than who I am, like at these temporal and spatial scales that I can't even fathom or follow, like literally. And so yeah, I think there are all these different ways in which like subjectivity is accessible or inaccessible. And yeah, I hope that kind of answers your question.
Anu, go ahead.
Yeah, sorry, I don't know. Somehow I can't find the raise hand thing today. Paul, I really liked how you start the introduction to your book with this episode about the tusker that's there, and there are these people, uh, primarily young people, who are following him, and it's somehow the whole thing is very playful. And I found that the way you mentioned how there is an older person there, and when you voice concern that the elephant might get aggravated by the closeness of all the people, this person tells you that the elephant is able to recognize the fact that there is an absence of hostility in the way the people are drawing closer to him, and that there's a certain uh, element of playfulness which the animal, the elephant here, is able to recognize and respond to. That was one thing which I found moving and also very significant. And then the other thing that I connected with that was the fact that you say that you're using concepts from the study of human relationships to sort of explore and frame how human elephant relations play out and how one can perceive them and understand them. Things like dialogue, for example, or you mentioned collaboration, solidarity, I think, and gift exchange. Um, and I was just thinking that primatologists have also done something very similar. Duval, for example, Franz Duval, who's talked about using heuristic anthropomorphism, and to sort of establish that there is reconciliation, which one had only associated with humans until then as a way of ending conflicts or as post-conflict behavior. And Duval is able to show, starting from the premise that there is the possibility that this exists also among primates. And he, by applying this category, or this concept, she is actually able to show that it's not only the risk of injury which makes primates stop fighting, let's say, but that, they also want to reestablish the sort of broken, ruptured relationship afterwards and become friends again. And I thought it's a really great idea. It's a very fruitful way of approaching the alterity of beings that is, as we just discussed, inaccessible. And as a way of maybe trying to comprehend or get closer to the subjectivity of animals that are, yes, different from us, but keeping in mind the fact that there might also be similarities. Maybe our observations show us that they're not there, but maybe they also show us a way of looking at what they do so that it makes sense. I'm a fan of this, and I really wanted to know how you feel about this, this sort of accusation of anthropomorphism as a dirty word that is flung at people who want to use concepts from the study of human behavior to approach human animal behavior.
Great. Thanks, Anu. That's a great question. So I'll just, the first off, firstly, I'm happy that you recognize this kind of playfulness in the opening ethnographic vignette. And I think, because I was a bit kind of worried that maybe the rest of my book wasn't having that. And so that's why I made sure I had that at the start, just to, put in, because I mean, yeah, like it's very fluid, isn't it? Like, it's not like, relationships aren't always, adversive. They're not even, conflicting. Sometimes can be play. And that's an important part of living with wildlife too, right? So, yeah, I mean, it's, yeah, great. So I'm very happy about that. So the second question, wow. So, anthropomorphism, it is a dodgy word, isn't it? It's such a tiresome word to come up against all the time. And it's a kind of word I just like to ignore nowadays, because I mean, it just makes me do work that I feel I don't have to do at this point. And there's, other more fruitful ways of exploring animal life, subjectivity, and relationships. Yeah. And so I'm familiar with Deval, but not too much. So I won't try and pretend like I am, but I really, this example of reconciliation is really interesting, right? Because I mean, it's there's a kind of risk, isn't there? Taking a word like that, like, it's a social word with so much kind of implied meaning in human relationships and putting it to apes, right? And there's a risk, like you said, like the risk could be like you're overestimating what's happening, right? But the good part of the risk is that you're opening your, like, see what you seem to be saying is like opening yourself up to possibilities that you might not have considered before, right? And yeah, I think for me that's absolutely like how I feel about, like, yeah, bringing in concepts like the idea of dialogue, for example, which Elizabeth Oriel and other people have used, and yeah, and also collaboration, is that, yeah, like it just allows you just to have a shift in frame just a little bit, right? And if we get it wrong, that's okay. Yeah, it's okay to get it wrong sometimes, as long as we're trying to be honest and seeing the limitations of such a word and describing things. But if we're also getting things right, like, how good is it? Yeah, I mean, like, then we can actually start seeing that, maybe there is if we talk about the word dialogue, for example, which I really liked, it's because it opens up such a interesting possible array of thinking of how we're actually interacting with elephants, right? And who elephants are. And are we having a conversation? Are elephants trying to speak to us in some ways? Like, for me, it kind of creates this kind of openness, and I think, and this possibility of deliberation. And so, yeah, I'm a kind of big fan of that kind of approach you just described. And so, yeah, I mean, I think maybe I definitely think it's throughout the book. I don't know if I theorized it specifically on it, but yeah, I think this certainly was my intention. Yeah, thank you.
Just to follow up on what Anu was talking about and also on subjectivity, could you tell us a bit about how you found elephants? Like, what did you think of them um, subjectively? Because I also know that you work on wild boars, and in my experience, farmers they definitely know wild boars as much as they know elephants, but they seem to have much nicer things to say about elephants, at least sometimes. And, you give them any quality like intelligence, they always, just really do not like boars. But, scientifically, we know that boars themselves are very social beings and have networks and families and so on. So then, since I think all of us agree that we live in these shared social worlds, there's something about the subjectivity of the elephant that is more accessible to us. So I guess I want to know why do you think that is, and what you thought about elephants you encountered in Assam?
Yeah, well, that's also a great question. Kind of a tough question, actually, despite its simplicity. I think so. I guess yeah, with Pete, like with boars, right? Like yeah, obviously there is a constant kind of like negative framing of these animals, right? And like, and it's for me, it's kind of depressing how like almost global it can be sometimes, across whether it's South Asia or into Europe and Australia as well, and I think, yeah, that these kind of things seem to get emphasized a lot with pigs, unfortunately. And they know, these are, stories we inherit, but also, and like, the way, the government kind of like can sometimes frame these animals in relationship to the environment. I guess there's all these kinds of reasons. And, in ways that they're kind of training our perception, our responses, and how we think to these animals. But I mean, yeah, with elephants, elephants for me are just always these kind of beings. There's kind of no limit to them, right? And you can associate all these different potential possibilities, and whether it's like, murderous intent and violence, but also incredible, gentleness and care and intelligence. And, I think in ways that they have this kind of their figure that in popular imagination that allows us to, see these things in elephants more often. So yeah, it is. Yeah, it is. That's a complex part. I mean, for me, yeah. I mean, it's funny. I don't really, yeah, thinking about it now. Like when I first met elephants, they certainly grew in my esteem when the more I got to work with them. When I first came to do research, I was mostly interested in exploring them as a working animal, while full aware that they're quite intelligent beings, right? And like for me, it was more about looking at, collaboration and coordination in tasks. But yeah, I think, but the more there's so much stories in circulation, there's so many, nuances to their behavior, the more you look at them. And even despite having very different physiologies and bodies, very different behaviors, you can start to pick up these kind of amazing nuances in what they're doing. And yeah, for me, that kind of and the more you look at them, the more enriching it kind of gets, right? And this especially becomes even more complex when I'm living with people and working with people who have these concepts of elephants being much more than I could even possibly imagine within my own Western worldview. And I think that also, this kind of the need to become open to possibilities I couldn't really comprehend before, kind of really enriched what I thought of them. But yeah, I mean, but going back to pigs, because pigs is my thing at the moment, and I'm glad it's yours too. Yeah, it's the same thing, right? The more you with pigs, and the more you're open to thinking about them differently, and thinking about those kind of like aspects of their existence that's sometimes cut off from other people's awareness. Like, yeah, then that becomes richer as well, right? Yeah, it's just, I think, yeah. I mean, maybe, I'm not too sure. I can't say I've studied much about pigs or wild boar in India, but I think, sometimes, we make these kind of cuts on what we think an animal is and what they can do and what they can't. And yeah, maybe sometimes there's a very narrow way of encountering these animals and, within, the human world. And yeah, I'm not too yeah, it's unfortunate sometimes that it becomes so narrow that only negative stories and negative concepts kind of abound. So, yeah.
Yeah, Anu, go ahead.
Yeah, I have one more question, Paul, just taking up from what you were discussing right now. And I was just thinking, because you're also framing in your book how interspecies interactions, in this case, human-elephant interactions, extend across a really broad spectrum. But somehow only some aspects of this interaction are the ones that are known to, people outside the regions where they are located, let's say, because these are the ones that make news, be it, sort of a fixation on captivity or mostly then also conflict. Um, and I was wondering, do you find that in the places where people actually live with elephants and are not dependent on scholarly work or newspaper reports to know what it is like to live with elephants. Um, is there also an acknowledgement and a recognition of the fact that individual elephants and elephant subjectivities as elephants are two things, in the sense that people have a certain set of expectations, some kind of expected norms of elephant behavior, let's say, but there are always individual elephants that do not follow those norms, the ones that deviate. And let's say newspaper reports, as well as a lot of work that's done on field, sort of invisibilizes the fact that there are individual elephants which are different, distinct from elephants as such. Do you find that people who actually live alongside them, with them, are more cognizant of these differences or more attentive to individuality in elephants? And are you, as somebody who was there and um, observed these interactions for a long time, also find this space to frame individual elephants and their subjectivities rather than, Asian elephants as such? I mean,
Yeah,
basically,
great.
when you think of co-presence, basically, which I think is a great concept, is there space for individual elephants there?
Yeah, they're great. So that's like there. I mean, there absolutely is, right? And again, I think it does vary. Like we're talking about people who live alongside and with elephants. I mean, it does vary depending on their levels of intimacy and exposure and stuff like that. I think I think this is we understand that intuitively, right? So I think when I'm working with mahouts, for example, like they're very good. Like here's a good elephant, there's a bad elephant. Some elephants that just have ill temperament. You can't do much about it. There's just individual ones that yeah, they're just no good, right? And they have this sense that, all elephants, just like people, are quite different, right? And I think when you start looking at people who maybe, who live with elephants, with like as farmers and so on, or just live next to forests, yeah, I think people are full well aware that there are individual differences. And, this could be, for example, like, because people know that, for example, that there are, for example, an individual bull who will just come down and hang around the area and do his own thing. And people have spent a lot of time watching this bull and they get a sense of who it is as individual. And they kind of know, right? I think that kind of variation, that they understand that very well. But yeah, but at the same time, I mean, I think also people sometimes are prone to having kind of making kind of cognitive shortcuts like about what an elephant will do in response to people. So a common story I always heard was like I saw an elephant in the forest and the elephant chased me, or I came out of my house at night and the elephant chased me, right? And I don't think the elephant was chasing them every time, right? They just, I mean, I think maybe the elephant would, throw open its ears or make a huff, but it's just, yeah, it's just this kind of expectation. That's what the elephant's going to do, and so I'm going to have to clear out, and that ends up coloring how people perceive the elephant population, right, and what to do in those circumstances. And I can understand why it's there. Like, because I mean, this is this reason that people are having this idea is it has a history, right? Like, there's a kind of growing stress that's, encompassing the area. Elephants are kind of being, you know, continuously isolated, having to deal with people more often. And, and elephants are a bit more stressful, right? They are a bit more stressed, sorry. They're more likely to be volatile, using like Man Bodo's word, and like, they're more likely to respond in this way. And so, yeah, I think, people do make broad scale stereotypes sometimes and, just to define a certain characteristic of elephants. But yeah, but are they full? I think when the opportunities are able to do so, like when they see an individual herd, they are able to make comparisons and they realize that different families will respond in different ways, or depending, for example, on, how often they come to the village or so on and so forth. Yeah, I think, yeah, I was going to add something. Sorry, I just passed my mind. So.
Yeah, and I also wanted to ask whether for you as a researcher there, for you, not for the people who live with elephants all the time, whether this individual elephant subjectivity was also visible, something that you could try to access.
Yeah, so I was thinking about this recently, and yeah, I mean, absolutely. I mean, I think, okay, but I guess what do we mean by subjectivity, right? For me, I mean, I feel sometimes if I was talking about subjectivity and points of view and things like this, and I was speaking to a biologist, they're going to start thinking about perception, and they'll be like, "Well, it's very hard to think about non-human perception." They'd be quite right, right? I think grasping the qualia of another animal, let alone the qualia of a human, is a fraught practice, right? But I mean, we can do it pragmatically, right? We can be aware that when an animal is moving through the world and we're there with them and we see that they're responding to things in the environment, that our shared environment, they have intention, they have thought, they have, all these kinds of things. And I think, yeah, absolutely. I think absolutely when I'm looking at an elephant, when I'm with them, when we're doing things together, I'm always thinking about intention. I'm always thinking about how they might be kind of feeling and responding to me. So I mean, it's always subjective for me. I think it absolutely always is.
Krishnani?
Hello. Thanks a lot for a very engaging conversation. I'm really looking forward to reading your book and also the Composing Worlds with Elephants volume. I'm guessing that it's also forthcoming. I just wanted to ask the methodologies that you propose to, understanding how, people live with elephants and how elephants live with people in the region of Assam. Uh, Whether the same methodologies can also, or do you propose different methods to look at and deriving from Anu's and the previous conversations? How do we look at negative encounters, for example, of elephants actually chasing people or coming into fields, resulting in a loss of property and loss of houses, loss of lives also in some instances, and also the people interacting or the people reacting with extreme violence or extreme reactions from both people and elephants. I think there was a case of an elephant being set ablaze by a hula hunting party in Jhargram in East India. So how do we understand those interactions also? Are they in line with the effective economies that you trace in the book, or do they call for an entirely different methodological approach?
Yeah, wow. Thank you very much. That's a great question. Okay, so I'll probably just talk about people if that's okay, because that's kind of my safe ground. And but it's all kind of interrelated here. So I think so. I kind of throughout the book I kind of deal with this kind of concept of vulnerability. Okay, and I think about it. There's two ways in vulnerability kind of emerges. So firstly, there's the kind of vulnerability I feel that you're gesturing to, which is like that kind of vulnerability where there's a group of people or a group of animals like elephants who are kind of increasingly marginalized. So societies like marginalizing them in certain ways that then they don't have, like they're lacking agency or support, which can lead to certain kind of problematic outcomes, right? And then there's the other form of vulnerability I take as a broader notion of vulnerability, which is like the vulnerability that's like a condition of being human or a condition of existence itself. It's just that when we're in relation to things, when we're in human-animal relations or human-human relations, we're always exposed to being affected and shaped by those relations in ways we can't control. Okay, so I think those are the kind of two things. So I think throughout my book, I give emphasis to this second notion of vulnerability in order to map out coexistence, right? Because I'm trying to move away from this this kind of more, looking at the negative encounters of vulnerability, right? Those extreme moments, but then just try and see the other ways that people are subtly affecting elephants and elephants are subtly affecting people. That being said, like I certainly feel that I came across instances, and they're in the book, about these moments where people have just become so exposed to elephants, right? Become so vulnerable to them that it ends up resulting, I feel, in an extreme violent reaction, right? And so kind of following up with this, so that I feel there's two forms of conflict in the book. There's conflict, for example, which is just part of coexistence, right? Elephants come in, you need to drive them off. It's about mitigating the negative effect. It's controlling how vulnerable you are in that negative effect. But then there's a form of conflict in which people are trying to do these kind of radical exclusions, which is, killing, for example, trying to remove an elephant completely from an area or scare away a herd. These are kind of radical exclusions. And this form of conflict is trying not to live with the trouble of living with elephants. They no longer want elephants present in their lives, right? And these are the kinds of extreme examples that I see emerging. And I think it does, like, I think using this concept of vulnerability, right, and thinking about how these actions are either willing to continue to stay with the vulnerability of living with elephants, or the action wants to completely remove the existence of elephants altogether and that sense of being vulnerable to them. Yeah, I think, I think you can use that concept in order to explore these more extreme examples. So I think there was one couple of cases uh, uh, not far from where I was working where there was a couple of electrocutions, right? And I think, people spoke about elephants in such a way that they called them demons and like Ohur and it became this point. They started referring to elephants as demons because elephants would no longer listen to their prayers, right? They didn't see any kind of communication involved anymore. This was also a place where the forest department was completely ineffective. These people were, socially and economically, they were immobile. They couldn't go anywhere. They had no options, and this ended up resulting in extreme violence. And I think for me, it was mostly because, like, yeah, I mean, all agency have stripped from them, and then yeah, they were just extremely exposed to elephants in a terrible, terrible way.
That's a very productive way of thinking about it. And I also wanted to connect it with some dilemma that we face in Indian universities, in multiple Indian universities, with the case of street dogs. And it is very telling that the issue is rather overlapping with some of the issues that you are talking about. For example, um, those of us who are in the feeding community, who take up the responsibility to feed the dogs in campuses, who are also held responsible for whatever the dogs do. Right. And many a time there are people who actually get bitten by the dogs or who are chased by the dogs, the students who are chased by the dogs, and that also changes their entire outlook towards the dogs in campus and in the surrounding areas, etc. And that also leads them to becoming a lobbying group for throwing out the dogs from campuses, etc. Right. So what is the frame, or is there a frame that you can propose for thinking about this problem, which takes seriously at once the fact that the dogs are equally vulnerable and they are made available for this very act of being thrown out of the campus, and also the affective reactions of the people who actually get maybe quote unquote traumatized by the dogs. Is there like a frame that can bring these two together and take these two seriously enough in proposing maybe a solution if it comes to that?
Again, good question. I feel that I can't answer it, at least on the spot. It's because it's not really kind of my, it's not the kind of thing I just engage in thinking about, unfortunately. But like, yeah, I mean, feel free to send me an email because it would be kind of an interesting discussion I'd like to have, and maybe I could think of something, yeah, in the meantime, if that's okay. Sorry for the non-response, but yeah, I don't want to act like I know something when I don't.
Absolutely. Yeah. Thank you very much.
No, thank you very much.
Jyoti brother.
Hello, my name is Jyoti Mohanto. I work as a biologist in an NGO. So I have been working with elephants for quite some time, and I noticed something. I think you have worked in Assam. So have you worked in the district of Gwalpara? So the elephants in the district of Gwalpara have become somewhat more violent. I mean, I have seen the killings, I have seen the destruction. So, I mean, what's your take on that? Why are the elephants becoming more violent? I mean, as a biologist, I can say something like they are losing their habitat and this and that. But what's your take on that? So, I just want to know that.
Thank you very much, Jyoti Prata. Yeah, I look. I mean, I again, like, I mean, I don't want to speak too much about these things. I think it's, but I mean, obviously, I mean, for me, it's the continued stress, right? I think this is a kind of big part, right? And we can imagine there might be behavioural patterns occurring, I guess. But but I guess, I guess maybe I'd have a question for you then. Is like, what is the kind of history of relations here? Like, what led to these escalations? What were the environmental changes being involved? why, is it just an individual elephant that's doing this, or is it a small group of male elephants, or, is it consistent across a broad population? And the question, like, and when we're talking about elephant violence, what kind of violence are we talking about, right? I mean, are we, are we drawing on stories that, think about this notion of rogue and stuff like that? Or, are we seeing something, very particular? I mean, it's a kind of tough one. I mean, I'd like to hear, I would like to learn more. Also, I guess it makes me think of my colleague Sayan Banerjee, has been doing work in Goldpara, but I mean up on the North Bank as well, and certainly in spaces in the tea gardens where like conflict has been getting much more severe. But I can't say I've ever heard accounts of their like elephants becoming increasingly violent and specifically targeting. So I guess maybe one question I have for you, Jyoti Bhatta, is that could you give us a story of like, for example, like, an instance where like like elephants are becoming like, specifically more violent and,
So yeah. So the district of Gwalpara didn't really used to have elephants. So elephants mostly came from. This is what I have heard. Elephants mostly came from Garo Hills to the district of Gwalpara. They are not a permanent elephant of the. Because there is deforestation going in and in Garo Hills, so elephant moved to Gwalpara. And I have seen our NGO is working in Gwalpara, and we always regularly receive reports of killings by elephant. I mean, deaths of people where elephants have mauled them, and it seems like elephant behaviors are becoming more and more. How can I say that? More and more irritating towards people, and I cannot really tell you specific, but our and more than 10, 15 deaths last year. So yeah,
okay,
that is all I can say right now.
okay, no,
I will
no
I will
worries.
have to look at the data so for that.
Sure, but yeah, sure. Send me an email as well. I'm also always interested to talk about this stuff. So please,
Yeah, sure.
thank you.
Takshila?
Hi. So my question, Paul, is based on the conclusion of your book, where you have posed the question of what does it mean to be more vulnerable when it comes to elephants, and you recognize that this is not a question with an easy answer. So apologies, but I'm going to ask you whether you could just elaborate a bit more on this idea of vulnerability and what forms you were thinking of when you decided to end on that note. Thank you.
Hi, Takshla, how you going? Nice to meet you online. That is yeah. Okay, so obviously, like I think, the kind of line I follow throughout the book is that, to live with elephants who are such, impressively huge, formidable, and sometimes dangerous animals, like it comes with a degree of risk, right? And especially in the current contemporary times where environments are changing, elephants are appearing in places they didn't used to be, elephants and humans are entering into new interfaces with new forms of susceptibilities and risks that, people are becoming vulnerable to elephants in new and sometimes, more difficult ways. And together with elephants, they're always trying to find ways to coexist together, right? I think this is also the part that's sometimes unrecognized is that, I don't think elephant and humans necessarily, especially at certain levels, they're out to destroy each other. Like they're just, they're trying to negotiate the best they can with the conditions they have. And sometimes it gets a bit, stressful and harsh. Certainly as it sounds like what we heard from Jyoti Bhatta before. So, but yeah, so I think if I remember in the conclusion, I was saying, well, what the general trend, I guess I was just kind of like, reproducing the lie that anthropologists have always done is that, like, there's been a general trend sometimes with conservation groups, particularly conservation groups, that can sometimes be organized by the global north. is that, looking for programs to like solve these issues of coexistence, to remove the vulnerabilities to elephants and also to people to agree. And quite often it's asking those people who are already existing with elephants, in these risky situations to further, give up their sovereignty, to give up what they have, to reduce any agency. And for me, that's a huge kind of injustice, right? I mean, it's a lack of respect for recognizing that people are already doing the good work of coexistence themselves and not supporting it. And yeah, it's just, the need to kind of relocate people or discipline their movements or change their attitudes. I mean, it's a way they're asking people to submit to things beyond their power to control. And that's always a problem for me. So I guess the question was like, who needs to become vulnerable to elephants? I mean, I guess maybe I didn't want to answer it because it opens up a whole new can of worms, right? But I mean, honestly, who needs to become vulnerable to elephants is not the local people living there, right? It becomes, a particular issue that I would like to see directed towards, certain, or like, whether it's like state infrastructure or, corporations or industry plantations, for example. And even as a few of my colleagues would say as well, like in India, they would also say, well, we also need to start thinking about like the ways in which, I think countries outside of India, like other countries, particularly colonial countries, need to somehow give up something, whether it's monetary or otherwise, in order to better support the forms of coexistence that are happening on the ground already, right? And if, for example, if state infrastructure in India has to change in order to accommodate for elephants in their own ways of life, then maybe there needs to be, and that costs a lot of money, there needs to be ways in which, other actors beyond Indian state, needs to support these possibilities for coexistence. But yeah, I think, it's a tough question. I don't think I've actually answered your question at all, Takshila, but
Thanks, Paul. I think you have in a way, because I've been thinking of in my own work, reducing vulnerability does not have to necessarily be reducing vulnerability that is directly from the elephant, but you reduce other forms of precarity that are also socially and politically constructed. I feel like the people would be okay with losing some part of the crop because it's also considered, oh, we're going to lose this percentage of the crop to animals anyway. But can the state just pay me my insurance, give me my recompense? So maybe you were going in that direction at the end when you recognize the idea of power imbalances within either global north and south or the central state and the villages. Thank you.
yeah, great. Thank you very much. Because I think absolutely the case. And I think what's interesting about like vulnerability is that, yeah, once you start, like exactly as you said it, right? It's not like reducing that precarity to elephants, but all the other ways in which that amplify that precarity, right? And I think once you start thinking about vulnerability, it makes you realize that the way to solve these issues is through like distributed support and not necessarily by, changing that specific interface. So yeah, I completely agree. So, yeah.
Rapti, did you want to ask something?
Yes, thank you. No, my question was actually quite close to the last question. I mean, listening to you, Paul, I was also putting your work, I haven't read your book as yet, but also putting your work in conversation with some of Man Barua's early work, and also the context I'm more intimately familiar with in the case of Sri Lanka, where you've got what you call the cult of the wild elephant that's very much sort of entangled in post-colonial vast forest bureaucracies and safari culture and all that. But a more pointed question here is getting back to your use or sensibilities around the question, around your use of the concept of co-presence. And I wondered how you also engaged with probably broader sensibilities around dwelling in, again, sharing space, holding space, and also given the fact that elephants, and as a charismatic megafaunal species, migrate, right? I mean, they're immensely mobile, and that kicks up a whole lot of other questions about sedentariness and questions of place and placemaking, but also rupture, and the kinds of and embodied embodiment in the broadest sense of sojourn.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Good. Okay. Good. Yeah. So, how do I start here? So I guess yeah, I think maybe there's certain points in the book where I think this notion of place and holding place, and I think particularly ideas of where elephants can go and people can't, or places that elephants can't go, people can. I think there's a constant kind of theme throughout the book, but particularly it starts arising up when I look at last two chapters, which look at like coexistence in the forest and dwelling in the forest with elephants and what that means. And then also the chapter after that, which looks at how, elephants and humans, or humans trying to collaborate with elephants in order to hold open space, change the world in ways to make it more accommodating for elephants temporarily so they can pass through. So you end up actually having this realization of an integrated human elephant world. But yeah, I think co-presence always plays a big part in that. And I think the latter example there, that was, quite, that emerges out of interaction. But like in the forest, this sense of co-presence, it's always in tune about expectations where an elephant might be, but also presence also with the landscape. Your engagement with the landscape is the way that you're kind of, what did I say? Coexisting at a distance. I can't remember what I said, or something like that, right? And so, this way in which you're co-present through the landscape with elephants, and that's another way in which you kind of share and live alongside them, right? So I think there's that. But then there was other. I guess thinking about it now, there's other ways in which, elephants also have shaped the atmosphere of the landscape that one lives in. And so I think the chapter 2, I'd kind of look at like elephants as being godlike beings who are omnipresent, right? And they're able to hear things at great distances and so on. And in some ways, like people talk about elephants peering like from 10 kilometers away. And it's something quite unusual at the sense that the presence of elephants is not just in their individual bodies, but extends out and can encompass an entire landscape, which can kind of shape the subjectivities of people and how they choose to think about and respond, and these kind of amazing figures, right? So, yeah, yeah. So I guess, yeah. But yeah, certainly, I think the forest chapter is the way to kind of explore in which being co-present with elephants through the landscape, but a landscape that allows for a kind of porosity and fluidity, allows for a form of co-presence that enables shared space and coexistence. But yeah, I hope that answers your question.
I just wanted to talk a little bit more about co-presence before we wrap this up. Because, I remember I think in the introduction or the first chapter, you say something like, I don't mean co-presence is the same as pragmatism. And I was thinking about how a lot of coexistence in places where there are elephants it's determined by the forest department and the techniques, the fences, the barriers. And since that's what's introduced or offered as a solution, often locals demand that these barriers be strengthened, or if the fence is not intact, they will ask that it be rectified and so on. So then, if there is a general trend where people demand that the government actively takes care of human-wildlife conflict, then what modes or what ways can we recognize this co-presence? And is it something that's vanishing?
Yeah, great. I mean, there's something troubling, isn't there, by the way, which kind of I think colonial structures and divisions between forest and like the farm, forest and village, has really kind of structured how people imagine or play out co-presence with elephants. And when it becomes too much, right, it becomes particularly destabilizing and uncertain when people start finding that elephants are going beyond the presumed boundaries of the forest, right? Which apparently the government is meant to mediate, right? And they've set up all these kind of rules around it, but they're failing dramatically, right? And so these kind of colonial and post-colonial structures are really kind of shaping how people are aware of elephants, absolutely, how they respond to it and what they think is appropriate, right? Absolutely, yeah. But I feel that that's probably more pronounced in places where elephants are an issue, right? The more an elephant is a problem and is making you feel exposed and susceptible, the more you want, the government to come in and reinforce the boundaries that they've been holding up for the last 200 years or 150, 200 years, right? But I mean, in spaces where it's not really an issue, I think that's where you start seeing that more, less pragmatic and more interesting forms of co-presence emerging, right? Where people are more open to, like, watching, having fun with elephants. They're not so already so primed to respond with stress all the time. And I think I think they're the kind of spaces where it can happen. So maybe, and just kind of queuing off, just working back off what Takla was talking about as well. So if we're finding other ways to support and kind of mediate that kind of precarity, that tension that occurs, right? That's the possibility where we might see these other forms of co-presence emerging. So I'm thinking of, when I think about this stuff, I'm always thinking about the paper by, oh my God, I've forgotten their names. Anyway, so it's about like the lemon crops in North Bank Assam, right? And so there was a lot of tension there, a lot of, human elephant conflict. There was a lot of stress. And then, conservation groups came in, the idea of like, stop planting rice, plant lemon trees, right? And so that's an interesting example because, I mean, not only is it, the idea is that not only, it doesn't stop elephants from coming, elephants keep coming in, but people aren't primed to respond to them because the elephants aren't going to eat their crops. They're not worried about it so much. And I think it creates a new effective space, right, in which people are able to appreciate elephants a bit more and in more interesting ways. So yeah, I think it's not, it's not necessarily disappearing. It's just maybe the ways in which we choose to handle these kind of like problematic, interfaces. We have to think about maybe giving solutions that can open up people more in more, interesting ways to elephants, right? Yeah.
I just have one last question, which is that, especially because of increasing human-elephant conflict, violence is something that's it's really important to people, and especially if somebody is injured or if somebody dies, then really the public opinion can really turn against a particular elephant. But at the same time, we also know, and in one of your chapters, you talk about how one particular railway track, around 15 elephants had died because of that, because of the way it turns. So when we're thinking about co-presence, how can we think about violence, and especially in the Anthropocene, where people can take decisions that can disproportionately affect them, but not just violence in that meta sense, but also between groups. A lot of people criticize mahouts themselves for being violent in their relationships towards captive elephants. So how can we think about co-presence ethically? Is there a way of thinking about that could provide some kind of multi-species justice for both the elephant and the human?
Great question. And so I think, co-presence, and I think when I say co-presence, I'm always thinking about vulnerability and dialogue. I think all these things are part of it. I think that's the cornerstone of ethical relations, right? For me, like if you're not being present, if you're not present to the elephant, if you're not like open to being exposed to them, then you can't really have an ethical relationship. And that's precisely the issue I found with trains, right? Is that trains, kind of the way they're built as a kind of railway system, they just close themselves off from like local actors and human or non-human. And that's where this kind of really terrible violence emerges, where they just like end up like cutting byways and cleaving apart habitats and also people's homes as well, right? So yeah, I think, and that for me, that was the ethical issue at the heart of trains, is that they don't really know how to be co-present with elephants, right? They don't really know how to respond, right? And response and the openness to response and the openness to change, like the openness to kind of slow down and listen, this is the heart of all things. So I think, we're going to be aware of that, whether that's present or not. So I think, when it comes to mahouts, like mahouts can be violent, right? And I think that can happen sometimes. And I think, but you always have to put the violence in kind of context of what's going. Sometimes the violence is pragmatic, right? It has its place sometimes. Sometimes it's not as bad as it might appear to be. Sometimes the violence might emerge out of other problematic things as well. Like, for example, a lot of mahouts can come from, particularly marginalized classes of people. And they sometimes that's how they act out some of their issues, are sometimes on the elephant too, right? I mean, I don't want to delve too much into hood stuff because sometimes there's kind of strong ideological divisions there. Yeah, I think absolutely. I think, I think a consideration of violence and what violence means, I think always needs to be taking into account, this kind of co-presence and whether it exists or not. And I think, yeah, it's a good starting point for an analysis, in my opinion.
Oops. Thanks, Paul, for spending this 1 hour with us. It was really great to hear about your book and to listen to everyone else who asked such great questions. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you very much, guys. It was a pleasure. It really was.